Hey everybody, how are you guys? Happy Friday afternoon. I hope everybody's having an amazing start to their Friday. Thank you for being here. So today we're going to go through a few key things that I think will be very exciting. I've had a lot of people, so these, just for the record, all of the webinars that are not the Q&A webinars for the entire month are literally based on themes that you guys voted in the Personal Development School Facebook group, like things you really wanted to see. We didn't do a course in limerence this month, so we're doing 3 webinars to really dive into all of that. So there's going to be a lot of information literally based on the questions you guys have. A couple quick announcements as well. We have our first workbook module done being edited, and it's like basically a 30-40 minute module. It's for the needs course, and it's basically me, just, you can't even see me, it's just like my hand and the workbook, and it's being filmed from above, and it's basically going through and filming that whole workbook, how to do the exercises, how to follow along, all of that. We're going to post a few more soon after, but we would love feedback on them because we still have a whole bunch more to record. So I'm going to post that in the needs course. And then if you guys have feedback, I'm going to post a post in the Personal Development School Facebook group. And then that way, if there's stuff you want to see more of, if there's like, oh, hey, can you still do this part of the workbook module and exercise? Like, let me know. And then we're going to use that as like a succinct final version. And we're going to be adding to every single course just a workbook module of just me like going through, filling out the workbook so that, and doing the exercises myself and using examples so you guys can actually see and have that like extra guide to follow along. So very excited about that. We also have one of our accountability coaches. So we've brought on one accountability coach, somebody I've worked with in the past and trained in the past and has been doing this work for, I don't know, I guess the past 5 or 6 years. And his name is Mike, and he's going to be answering some questions. You guys might see that he's answering some extra questions in the discussion forum. And then something we are planning on doing long-term is we are planning on having like a premium package where basically you get 2 calls a month. So with this person, so to like sit down, we're going to try to make it like as affordable as possible. So it shouldn't be too big of a jump from what you're paying now. But it's just an option for people who like want a touch point. He is a dismissive avoidant by history, turned into a secure individual and a male. And I thought that would be a really great space because, a lot of people want to know, like, dismissive avoidant, what do they experience? What are they feeling? All these different things. So he's also a really beautiful human being. So, so you'll be able to like ask him questions, stuff like that. We're just going to intro it and try it for 3 months, see how it goes, because it's a lot of like scheduling and managing stuff from our end. And we've got a lot going on between all the courses and the webinars and the workbooks and the Facebook groups and the math, like all the different things that are taking place. We've got all these things. So we're going to see how it goes, do a trial period. I'm going to post something as well in the Facebook group because we want to see like who would be interested. So we know like how many people we'll have to bring on long-term. We're just going to use him first. And then if that goes well and goes smoothly, we will bring some other individuals on from there. And we're thinking of doing like a TA program. Just there's some of you guys, sorry, I'm like full of announcements and news, but there's so many of you guys in here who I'm just like, I would say are like the turning into like the veterans of PDS. I know we haven't been, open online for the longest time ever, but just I see a lot of you and like, you are super in touch with the work, super aware, communicating with other people, showing up, all these different things. And so we're thinking of doing, it was based on a suggestion from one of you guys. I forget who suggested it, but thank you. We're thinking of doing like sort of a TA program where people can work with people who have been here, who feel really equipped to understand and maybe share some of the content themselves, just stuff like that. And again, these are just like long-term ideas. So I'll be putting a post on Facebook that like really tells the different options of what's going to happen. And I would love to see like who's interested, put your vote in there and what you want to see specifically, because it gives us direction on which way to move and which way to grow. So thank you guys all so much for being here and doing that. And then our courses for this month, which I'm like so super excited about, are how to overcome loneliness and the science of connection. And so it's a sort of like a 2-part course where it's the first parts are like, what is loneliness made up of? How to deconstruct loneliness and then reprogram the parts within you that might be creating that. And then the second part of the course is all about how to actually build bonds and connections with people and like what's required and in the different stages of relationships, like the dating phase, but with friendships, for example, it's like the vetting phase, what's required and how different attachment styles move throughout those different phases and how to like keep building rapport and connect with people and the science of what happens in your brain and physiology. And so that's an exciting course. And then the communication scripts, I'm probably even more excited about. And it's just this long form course of like, talking a little bit about communication, nonverbal communication, body language, all that stuff, the stuff that we need to know in terms of how we show up, and a checklist for you to go over for like, am I communicating effectively in all ways? Because most of communication is actually nonverbal. And then how to actually communicate so that you get heard, what the steps are, and then a whole bunch of different scripts for different situations that you guys specifically picked. So like how to communicate your needs to this person, how to handle a breakup and ask for closure, how to break up with somebody if you don't think that it's the right relationship, how to ask for something to change if somebody returns from the past and wants to start a relationship and you're like, hold on, I'm on a personal growth journey now, and these are the things that I want to dive into. So there's so much in there, which I'm very excited about. We have over 50 different scripts, and I'll be modeling some of those out and talking about potential objections and what to do and all those different things as well. So very excited. It'll be like a different type of course too, because it'll be a lot more like modeling and interactive and these sorts of things. So I think those are all the announcements for right now. And a big thank you to everybody who's put in like their suggestions and ideas and all these different things, because it really gives me clear direction about which way to do things. And it's fun for me in like the creative process of creating content and courses. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into some of these things. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to answer the first few questions. Just a reminder, as much as we can, if we can stay, like keep questions on point to the topic. Open questions are for the open Q&A sessions. So I am going to try to, if I see anything that's off track for the content, I'm going to try to really track it back to what the content is today. And what we're going to go through today specifically is we're going to talk about like intimacy and vulnerability and how to stop deactivating and what deactivating is really made up of when we are in the different stages of a relationship. So what you'll notice is that fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance, who both have an avoidance side, they deactivate differently in the dating phase than they do, for example, in the stability phase. And we're going to talk about like what deactivating is based off of and how to get that into regulation, because I think a lot of when we're trying to become secure, like a lot of what sabotages that is that if you still have an avoidance side, there's still going to be this push-pull dynamic. And particularly for fearful avoidance, that's a really painful thing. Like it's not fun to be in a relationship and to be like swinging back and forth all the time, because you're not settling in, you're not fully like being in the relationship 100% and being present and opening and thriving. And so it can be a huge self-sabotage mechanism. And so we're going to talk about how to tell the difference between a doubt versus a deactivation, an unmet need versus a deactivation, and what to really go through to solve this challenge on a long-term basis. So I'll answer the first few questions before we dive in. So Jill, hi Jill. Jill says, I just split from my husband who's a DA. I'm an FA. He says I have narcissistic traits and this hurt. Maybe I do. How do I stop doing these things in the future? It hurts and I've been in therapy 20 years to get better from my family of origin issues. How do I move forward? Okay. So first of all, I'm so sorry to hear that. And that's not a fun thing to hear. One of the things, and this isn't like the only marker by any means, but one of the things that I particularly tend to look for to determine if somebody is narcissistic, one of the first things I've noticed in working with different narcissistic individuals over the years through a variety of different contexts and circumstances is their ability to self-introspect and like ask themselves, like self-reflect really, like, am I this way? What's going on with me? Because one of the biggest things when there's somebody who's truly experiencing narcissistic personality disorder, one of the things that I find is like a very quick emerging pattern, though this isn't part of like any diagnostic criteria or anything like that. But what I do find is that there is a very limited ability to go, oh, what part of the problem was mine? Might I be a narcissist? Might I be narcissistic? Where am I at with this? And so just the fact, so that you're like, he says this hurt. Maybe I do. How do I stop doing these things? To me, that tells me, there's a pretty strong chance that you are not the narcissist. And what's probably happening, and maybe there's like narcissistic qualities or traits, like, who knows? And I think every human being has that to a certain degree. But narcissists are quick to, like, one of the patterns I'd always see when I was working with people who are narcissists, and different types of narcissists, overt, covert, vulnerable, what I would see very strongly is that they would, every time I would be like, hey, what do you think your part is in that? Or like, what can you be accountable for in that dynamic or situation? It would be like, well, that would have never happened if this person didn't do this, this, and this. And it's just like perpetual blame. Like, it's always like putting the blame back on the other person. A really strong wall would come up that was that person's ability to go, yeah, what was my part? What could I have done differently? It always goes back to, well, if my husband didn't do this or my wife didn't do this, then this would have never happened. And so, like, I just want to acknowledge that in your very first question, and being in 20 years of therapy and all these different things, narcissists are always very reluctant and resistant to going towards therapy as well. So to me, like, you have two markers that are, that's probably not you. However, there can be things that are being displayed that way as well, especially relative to the dismissive avoidant. And one of the big patterns that I see that can lead to this is that we can have a dismissive avoidant who is like, you should meet your own needs and I should meet mine, right? We have like the healthy interdependence in the middle. Then we have codependency on one side. And then we have sort of like too great of independence on the other side. And they can be also like sort of residing at the too much independent space. And then it goes like this. It's like, well, I'm really independent. You should be really independent. And then you might repress your needs or even fear because of things that live in you from past traumas that, it's not even acceptable or appropriate to express needs, and they're only ever going to get rejected. And so then you don't. And then you do all these things to give, because fearful ones can be quite generous by nature. And then you perceive this huge imbalance, which is what conflict is made up of. It's literally a perceived imbalance across space, time, energy, or matter. And you perceive this imbalance, you get frustrated, triggered, and then you lash out. And then here he is thinking, well, you're trying to like force me to meet needs, or you might manipulate to try to get needs met because you've learned on some level that it's not appropriate to get needs met. And yes, that can be a trait associated with narcissism, but usually there's like, that's a pervasive quality as opposed to something you're trying to do around specific needs that you might be experiencing. And so that's the difference between being like a manipulative person and having a manipulative moment. One is much more pervasive. The other is like, I don't know how else to communicate. I don't know how else to ask for myself. So when I feel like it's not okay to communicate about my needs or ask for them, I try to like find a roundabout way to get them met, because as human beings, we need to have our needs met in relationships. So what I hear, to be quite honest, is that like there's probably more of those patterns in there. So patterns around your needs, and then patterns around getting really triggered or frustrated when you have stories that you're telling yourself. And so what I would do is I would write down, what are the painful, what's my relationship to my needs, and when do I not get them met directly, or when do I try to manipulate to get them met because that's a symptom of me feeling afraid of actually communicating vulnerably, and how can I start working through those challenges and issues, and then what stories do I tell myself about the relationship, about myself, and try to list out as many of those things as possible in the Emotional Mastery and Belief Reprogramming course, and do the work on those stories, because those are the two major things that create the chaos and create that like intense output of emotion, or not so healthy strategies in a relationship. And those are the things you want to correct first. So I know that was a really long answer, but I just thought that was, and that's Football Madness is question as well. I'm also worried about this. My mom told me I was a narcissist and I'm so scared. I think she's one herself and I never want to inflict that on anyone. Okay. So my dear, like I just want to tell you right now, if you are a narcissist, your way of coming in here and sharing this would be like, my mother's such a narcissist. like it would be like very like blaming, like there wouldn't be a lot of codependents sort of fear this, right? And sometimes codependents can give to control. Like if I give, then you need to rely on me and I can control. And so that can be a quality that leans towards narcissism, but they're very separate things. And so, so my dear, the fact that you're worrying about it, the fact that you're here working on yourself, the fact that somebody's saying that, like, I would really question those stories and try to find pieces of evidence for why you may not be a narcissist, because both of you, like right away in the way you communicate, I would be very hard pressed to think that either of you were narcissistic. So, and like, I never want to inflict that on anyone. That just would not be the term. If somebody called you that, you'd be so busy getting angry at that person and so busy blaming that person and getting at that person in your mind that you wouldn't be like, oh no, I'm worried about being the one that causes pain. That's like very opposite to narcissistic. So I don't want you guys to worry. Sit down, do the work, like check, question those stories in the first place, but still see the places you can improve. And maybe set a boundary too, football madness with your mom, and just say, hey, like that was really hurtful. And if there's something you think I can improve on, I'd love to hear, but I don't want you to throw these really painful jabs towards me, because that really made me question myself, and that sort of hurt my feelings towards me and my character. So Jen says, I find that when guys I'm not interested in, or even my husband, currently separating with, express sexual interest in me, I get a gut emotion of disgust and revulsion. This goes against my values of wanting to be a kind person. How can I mend this within myself so I align? Beautiful. Okay, so what I would do first, Jen, is I would write out, like, because emotions are always an effect, okay? They can be a very immediate effect, so it can feel like they're like the very first thing that we feel. But there are very few circumstances in life that are like related to like biological emotion, right? And so the example we can give of this that I often use, but it's a really good analogy, is there's this tribe called the Satia tribe. And they're this very old tribe, and there's a little documentary film about them. And basically, they truly believe that death is like a blessing, and that this is the underworld. And so they have grieving ceremonies when people are born, because they feel like, oh, people are born into the underworld. And they have funerals when people, grieving ceremonies or funerals when people are born. And they have like true celebrations when people die. And there's an interview of this woman, and her mother's passed away. And she's so happy. And it's just like, wow, it's so interesting, because her emotions are completely in opposition to things that we would deeply feel are really painful and hard. And so it's a really good illustration of the fact that like emotions are the effect of other things. And so whenever we're feeling negative emotions towards something, we want to find like where that's coming from. We want to find the cause to that effect. And so you want to ask yourself, like, okay, the things in here, this is a really good thing for anybody to do. The things in here that I'm experiencing, are around men. Like, what are the themes? And around sexual interest. Okay. So what are all my beliefs or stories around men or sexual interest or sex, that might be stored in my subconscious mind that are creating some kind of feeling like this when things are moving in that direction? And where do these things come from? And try to get really clear about them, and then work on questioning those stories. And then in that as well, try to identify, like, how would I want to feel when something like this takes place? Like, how would I want to feel? Do I want to feel like safe and okay to be vulnerable with people and like express interest back in somebody else if I feel interested? Like, how do I want to show up? And then what's standing in my way? What are all the barriers to that? And how can I do the work to break through those stories? And I would use the Emotional Mastery Belief Reprogramming course for the source of that, because it really talks a lot about breaking through stories. And what you'll see is it's just probably stored emotional residue from painful things that you saw, painful things that you heard. It can be as simple as something like men only want sex. Like, there's so many painful stories we grow up with that create separation. And then, or, how women are objectified. Those might have been firsthand experiences you had, all these different things. And so you want to do the work around those things so we don't reproject those old stories onto every single person ever. Like, maybe you at the time you had a loving husband, and maybe you projected those things on, and it really creates this invisible wall. So those are important things to explore, and it's a great question. Hi, Anna. Let's see. The next question I have is Jersey. Hi, Jersey. Hi, Princess Con and Rochelle. When you see someone deactivating and you understand why and they don't, should you tell them, or is that condescending? Hi, Jody. Okay, so here's what I would say. And this is what we're going to dive into. I'm actually going to pause here and start diving into some of this so that we can see like where this is really coming from. And then I'm going to come back to that question because it will really align. So I want us to get really clear that there's like a very big difference, even though it's like sometimes hard to notice. It's sort of nuanced between deactivating and having doubts or seeing a red flag in a relationship. Okay. And there are different ways that people deactivate, but the vast majority of them, like if you look at what the root of deactivating is, it's based in fear. Okay. So when you see somebody deactivating, it's like, there's this funny thing that I often share with people, and it's like people will say, oh, I'm afraid of, people say anxiety. I think I talk about this in the anxiety course. Anxiety is the fear of the future. Depression is like, the sadness linked to the past. And like, that's not fully true. Okay. So you can't fear the future because the future is completely neutral. Like you can't know what's in the future. It's completely neutral. But what you can fear about the future are unresolved pain points from the past that your subconscious mind is projecting onto the future. So for example, like if you take a baby on an airplane, the baby's not like, oh my gosh, like an airplane, what if it crashes? Like the baby's not, because it's not thinking into the future based on messaging it heard, scary movies it saw, fears around flying, a scary experience from the past. It's not projecting anything onto the future. So the baby's like, oh, the baby might be uncomfortable in the seating or not want to sit for so long or not have a proper place, those things, but like it can't fear the future. And so but what happens is we go into our adult lives and then we have fears around heights or claustrophobia or different things happen that imprint us at a subconscious level. And then we project them into the future. So I want to like apply this to this analogy to the idea of deactivating. We're not like, oh, like the person could hurt us in the future. Like whatever you're afraid of in the future is literally an exact reflection of a stored subconscious wound that hasn't been resolved based on past experiences. And remember, there's 3 different ways that we get programmed. We get programmed through what we see repetitively, what we hear repetitively, or what we have firsthand experiences of. And so there's something in one of those 3 categories. It can be as simple as seeing a really scary movie when you're 2, 3 years old, 4 years old, and it can imprint you and you have a memory and you're old enough to understand, oh, that's about an airplane. And now I'm afraid of flying because I saw something repetitively that created a strong emotional imprint. And so those sorts of dynamics can cause a lot of fear. But that's what deactivating is based off of. When we are in a space as human beings, that's like, oh my gosh, this person could leave. This person could change their mind. This person could, X, Y, Z. You can't know that. And what that's telling you is not about what could happen in the future. It's telling you about what has happened in the past that you need to do work around and resolve and find healing towards. And so this is what we're looking for. And once you can see that deactivating strategies are based on fear and based on pain points from the past, you'll be able to start, because what a deactivating strategy starts at, its root level is it starts in thought, right? Technically, it starts in like previous imprints, and that creates thought. But you'll see that this dynamic is occurring if you sort of observe your mind. And we want to start being able to witness this and notice that it happens. Because when we activate as human beings, or when we have deactivating strategies as human beings, both of them do the same thing that triggering does. They get so close to our face, right? Or like we're so close to them that we forget that this could be a story or a wound. We're like so bought in. And the more stored emotion we have around something, the more likely we are to buy into it. The more painful, think of it this way. If you have a 10 out of 10 trigger from an experience that happened to you, let's say in like 7th grade with friends and being bullied, versus you have a, 2 out of 10 trigger about being bullied. If you take those 2 people and you put them in an office room in their 40s and they are both bullied, the first person who has 10 out of 10 stored pain there is going to react a little more intensely. Maybe not externally, but at least internally, they're going to feel a lot more emotion than the person with a 2 out of 10 experience of maybe being teased by friends and feeling like a slight betrayal. So these two things are going to be completely different. And the person who's reacting more strongly, they're so bought in, right? That maybe somebody plays around with them in their office at 40 years old, and they're like, everybody's talking about me, everybody hates. And it's like that thought emotion spiral that takes place where everybody's talking about me, you feel bad, then you think more painful thoughts, and then you feel worse, and then you think more painful thoughts. And that sort of vicious cycle that occurs just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And so part of what we have to do is notice first when we are activating or deactivating. And for this webinar, obviously, we're focusing on deactivating. So one of the first steps to noticing that this takes place is to notice what deactivating is. It's old stored subconscious fears that have a lot of emotional residue attached based on previous pain points that start coming up because they're activated, right? And then we start feeling like we have to protect ourselves from this pain. And we, at some subconscious level, are believing that person's the source of my pain, which they could be. They could do something that violates a boundary or something like that. But usually the need to like deactivate instead of resolve or set a boundary or speak up, in let's say 95% of cases, like obviously certain times there's things that are like somebody's being physically abusive or things like that. And we know like that's not deactivating. That's like your subconscious mind kicking in to protect you and you really need to leave. But the vast majority of the time where there are problems that are resolvable, the mind has this triggered pain, emotional residue. It starts getting really into its thinking. Oh, this person, I need to get away from this person, blaming, feeling afraid, pushing back, feeling like, the relationship's not going to work, doubting, questioning the relationship, projecting painful things onto the relationship. And then instead of resolving or working it out or emotionally regulating, we feel the need to push the person away to stay safe. So there are two different forms of deactivating that I tend to notice. We deactivate differently at all 6 different stages of a relationship. And we also, I find that the fearful avoidant and the dismissive avoidant tend to also have different types of deactivating. So fearful avoidants usually don't deactivate very often until they're like at 10 out of 10. And then when they do, they deactivate 10 out of 10. Like we deactivate to the degree that we're experiencing pain or suffering. And dismissive avoidance often have a lot more deactivating that's taking place. It's a lot more pervasive, but it's a little less. It's not like get away from me and anger and need to push the person away or fight or push back or flee so fast. It's usually this like pervasive deactivating, and not actually pervasive, like it's not nonstop, but it's happening quite often at sort of a smaller level. And these are the sort of things here. So what we want to be able to do is notice like, what is my type of deactivating? What types of thoughts am I having and feelings am I having when I'm deactivating? And the purpose of asking yourself this is to make this information conscious, because the more conscious you are of something, the easier it is to catch and find in the moment and thus regulate. Like if this stuff is happening and we're buying into our thoughts, the person didn't call you back, I'm never going to be with that person again. They said they would call at 3, it's 3:45. I'm never going to answer the phone again. I hope they call so I can hang up. Like, like sometimes we can get into like dramatic places. And so, you get so invested in that story because that subconscious trance relative to that past pain point is sort of taking over. And you're so like in that story of the pain that you're not able to see like, oh my gosh, this is me deactivating. This is me having a really painful time when my parents forgot to pick me up after school and I was waiting for them to get back to me or somebody to answer me. And I got really afraid and I felt hurt and left behind and forgotten. And it was this wound in my subconscious and it's appearing in this version right now. And that's actually where most of this pain is coming from. Or, I'm just sort of pulling things out of nowhere, like making up examples, but I hope this is all making sense so far, right? This is like what deactivating is made up of. And until you're clear about how you deactivate personally, and it won't be like finite, but there will be patterns and there will be specific emotions that you tend to experience. Until you're clear about that stuff, it's it's very difficult to stop it from happening, to regulate yourself or to adjust your behavior or your communication. And most things that human beings, let's say specifically FAs and DAs, are deactivating about are quite solvable problems by saying, hey, when this happened, this hurt me. And this is what I need next time, and see the need through. And a lot of the deactivating too is based off of, to be really clear, it's often based off of a premise or a subconscious concept or idea that you can't speak up and voice your needs. You can't communicate about your needs. It's not acceptable or it's not appropriate. And usually that's because of some kind of old belief pattern too. So it's like, wow, when a fearful avoidant or dismissive avoidant goes into a relationship, and I'm going to come back and answer questions in a second and pause, but this is just important framework to begin with. When a fearful avoidant or dismissive avoidant enter into a relationship and they feel like, well, I have to meet somebody else's needs to a certain degree, but then they have a belief that like, I can't get my needs met, I can't ask for my needs to be met. Right away, relationships become painful because there's right away going to be this perceived imbalance of like, I have to show up, but I'm not allowed to express myself, who I am, what I need, what I desire, etc. And if I do, that makes me weak, or that makes me too vulnerable, or I'll be rejected, or whatever pain points we have. And then of course you're going to deactivate, because you're deactivating to like create safety when we're in an unhealthy or unsafe dynamic, as long as we are operating from that belief pattern or space in the first place. So I hope that this makes sense. So Jersey says, yeah, Rochelle, that's an amazing idea. I didn't see it because it was not tagged. I was thinking maybe in the PDFs you can have a section for feedback where people can share their reviews. I love that. I think we sort of have something like that in the members lounge. My team takes care of that. But I think there might be that in the members lounge under surveys. But let me double check, and if not, I will let you guys know. Thanks for sharing that. It's a great idea. So Jersey says, when you see someone deactivating and you understand why, and they don't, should you tell them, or is that condescending? So it's a fantastic question. And I would say it's going to depend on, first, the attachment style, and second, the situation. So if a dismissive avoidant is deactivating and you tell them, hey, you're just deactivating, unless you've been in a space where you're having ongoing conversations about this stuff and this has been made a norm, which is usually a signpost of this person being en route to being secure, unless you're doing that, here's what they're going to feel. They're going to go, you're trying to manipulate me into feeling differently. Usually you're going to get a lot more pushback, honestly. And I've seen that in different couples dynamics and stuff that I've worked with over the years. That tends to be the output. It's like, why are you telling me how I should be feeling and what I'm feeling? And it sort of violates that sense of like autonomy. And so that can be frustrating. For fearful avoidants, when they're really deactivating, usually they're in so much stress and pain as well that's like, whoa, like I need to push back even more. And so they can be very frustrated. And it may not be the best time. So I would say in both cases, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. However, when fearful avoidants are coming out of deactivating, usually what happens with FAs is they go from deactivating, and usually, and you guys will notice this if you're FAs, you start activating. So normally, like, fearful avoidants are kind of swinging from, once the deactivation has happened, by the time you come back, usually there's activation. There's like guilt, seeing the good things about the person, and that's actually the mind equilibrating. And so you'll probably see that one tends to follow the other. Or if you're activating for long periods of time as a fearful avoidant, at some point soon, there's a certain deactivation that takes place or happens, right? Because a lot of activating comes with expectations and, oh, this person's supposed to be like perfect, or, all these different qualities that show up. So, and it won't be like, I'm not sure if anybody has this question, but this is what I would think of. It's not necessarily like BPD individuals who like, there's something called splitting. Activating and deactivating is like a much subtler version of that, if that makes sense. Okay. And splitting tends to be more final for BPDs a lot of the time. So Yeah, so that's the first part of that, right? Is that like you have to understand what the attachment style is. It's usually not the best thing to do. Fearful avoidance, after they've come out of deactivating, it's usually like good territory to have that conversation, especially if like you've started to have those conversations, and say like, hey, is it possible? Don't say you were deactivating. Say, hey, is it possible that that was some kind of deactivation because you were afraid or you were triggered? And that's how I would phrase it. And if you're starting to have conversations with a dismissive avoidant, you can say the same thing. Because if fear was cut, is it possible that a fear came up and that caused you to deactivate? I want to understand, things like that you want to ask. But to tell somebody exactly is probably going to have a painful result. But it's a fantastic question. And bringing up the topic is a productive thing to do for sure, especially if you have somebody who you're working with who's like moving towards becoming more secure with you. So, okay, so the next question I see is, you're working on your stories, you're fulfilling your needs, you're meditating, good job, but I still want to be with my partner who's taking a break. I want to give him space, but how can I navigate his deactivating strategies as his partner now or in the future? I think a really powerful thing to do, Princess Khan, I really pushed him for weeks instead of acknowledging his need for space, and it seems it confounded his deactivation. A great awareness. What more can I do to move forward so I'm not feeling stuck and waiting? And why is he deactivating worse during this time than during breakups? To me, it sounds like because of exactly what you said, which is great awareness, that you were accidentally not seeing him, which I'm so glad you see, because it's such a nuanced thing that has such a profound effect. And I just want to read this back because it's just a powerful thing. You said, let me see, I pushed him for weeks instead of acknowledging his need for space. And sometimes when we're like activating, you stop seeing somebody else's need and where they're at, and then it feels painful to that person. And you're right, it can sort of confound the deactivation, make it stronger. But what I would do in this situation is like a couple things. Number one, I can almost guarantee from the way you're talking about it that you have some kind of painful wound around waiting. Like, what does waiting mean to you? When were there times you were waiting for something in the past and it didn't happen, it didn't come through, and there was some kind of like triggering event there? And I would see like, try to work on that wound if you can find it. Number two, I would absolutely, like, if somebody's deactivating because you guys are having these conversations, I would bring up the deactivating conversation in the future. Hey, are you deactivating? When you are deactivating, is there anything I can do to make that, like, what do you need from me? Do you need me to hold space? Like, you want to grit some understanding around that topic big time, okay? And ask those questions. Like, do you need space? What's the best thing to do? What does it look like? Tell me specifically. And hey, when I'm activating, this is what I need in the situation. This is what I'm looking for. Or when I'm deactivating, this is what you can do. And the more you guys can start having conscious conversations about activating and deactivating, it is going to make a world of difference in the relationship dynamic, because both of you are going to be able to go, oh, this is me doing this. And you won't get so invested in the deactivating strategies and build a story out around it and then push people away accordingly, or pull people too close when they're not ready accordingly. And so it's a really powerful shift to take place. And it's a great question. So Kathleen, hi, Kathleen. I hope you shed some light on things to say and do when triggered. Before I joined PDS, I was triggered with shame and believing I ruined everything. I was aware it was happening, but at the time I felt powerless and like I did not have control of the withdrawal. We were just going to sleep and he put his hand on my arm, but I didn't know what to tell him that I needed. So I woke up the shell me. We were long distance and this was our last time together. I think maybe a hug would be helpful and us talking would be helpful. I know I have to confront the stories, but how do you communicate that you need reassurance when you feel yourself slipping away? Okay, so what I hear from you right now is this. I hear from you that you are feeling like you are in a space of deactivating. I like that you use the word shame, because often when deactivating is stronger and more pervasive, there's actually more shame involved. And it's like, oh, I'm feeling shame. There's fear and shame in this case are sort of together in that space. And I ruined everything. I'm telling that story, and now I'm withdrawing because I feel ashamed. So it's really important that you are aware It's the first step. Sometimes emotions can be so overpowering when you start this work, and it can feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm aware of this, but I can't seem to communicate vulnerably because I'm too busy like feeling shame and feeling invested in the story. It's honestly a great sign, because it's like you turning on your conscious mind when triggered instead of just going straight unconscious, straight into trance. You're starting to get some awareness in that moment from you as your conscious self. And that usually grows over time. But in the places there's really big triggers, I think everybody can probably relate to this at some point in time, where there's a really big trigger. It's like, oh, like you can get so invested, and part of you can know sort of in the background that you're being triggered, but the trigger feels like it's too strong. And so that shifts over time the more and more you observe. Like the more you're able to step out, it's like you're kind of building a muscle that's developing the capacity to step out, to witness yourself, to recognize what's happening. And when you get rooted enough there over time, you start to also have the capacity to make a change in the behavior or experience. So to answer your question, I just wanted to point out a few important things in there. Here's what I would do first. I would work on the story, I ruined everything. And I think I talked about this in a past webinar, and somebody on my team yesterday put a video out about it because they felt that it was really important. And it's about like really questioning the story of, hey, like, is it just me that ruined everything? Was there more to the dynamic? Was there anything that this person did that triggered? Was it, both of us together? Okay. And what was taking place? And so I would question the story, work to equilibrate the story first. Once you feel a little bit of relief around that, I would question the story too. I am powerless. Because you might have this idea I'm powerless, and then you're responding through that. But are you really powerless, or are there still things you can do right now? And so work on both those stories. And then I would ask myself, okay, what do I need now that this is all said and done? Because you're saying I didn't tell him what I needed. It woke up the shell in me. So you obviously withdrew really big time, and you're in long distance, and that was your last time together. And I'm sure you have this feeling of like pain and regret and wanting to work things out and fix things. And so here's what I would say. I would write everything out to yourself. Just first. Don't say, oh, I have to send this to him, anything like that. Just write everything out to yourself. And what I hear really strongly is basically this. I regret shutting down the way that I did. It was really hard for me not to. It was something that sort of had like power over me, and I wasn't able to prevent at the time. But I feel sad about it because I really do appreciate the relationship. I do want the connection. And what I really needed at that time was reassurance, because I felt afraid. And that would have looked like maybe you giving me a hug, or maybe just talking and opening up. And I can't guarantee that I'm never going to go into a shell and withdraw again. But this is my first step towards making a shift, is to take ownership of what was going on, to become conscious of it. And I wish I had, responded this way instead. And I'm going to try to do that next time. And maybe you can help me. And I would write that out. Maybe you can remind me, or maybe you can know to give me a hug next time. And hey, is there anything you need as well? And I would write that out just to yourself, but as if you were communicating to him. And then if you feel like, wow, this is really encompassing or encapsulating what I want to say, and you feel good about it, then I would consider sending it. And if you feel afraid and you have all these things that are like, oh, it's too vulnerable, and this fear pops up, pause. You don't have to do anything. Work on those fears. What are my stories? If I send this, then what am I afraid will happen? And work through those stories, break them down one by one, and work to equilibrate them. So you're releasing the things that are creating the resistance in the first place. And then you can decide from a really conscious space, not from subconscious woundedness, but from a really conscious space, as you remove those wounds. Okay, is this what I want to do? Do I want to send this thing? Is this something that really resonates with me and I'll feel good about? And then either way, you're making tremendous steps towards creating change. So great question. So the next question I have here is Football Madness. I'm excited to listen. I recently realized I'm FA and not AA. I shut down a lot, and I think I lost my feelings. Yeah. Yes, that sounds very FA to me. So it's good to know. And usually anxious, preoccupied, or usually fearful avoidance often think that they're anxious at first until they learn a little more, and they're like, oh, wait, I do have this avoidance side, but it only comes up so much. But when it does, it comes up quite strongly. Why do DA suddenly want to shut off even more after they are open with somebody. This negatively impacts my relationships with people when I want to get close to them. Yes, exactly. So this is a great deactivating story question. So what often happens for DAs is that, remember we said deactivating strategies are based on fear and old wounds? Well, the brain is like this association making machine, and it subconsciously stores all this information that you've gone through. It consolidates memories, but it doesn't really like get rid of things. And yes, memories can change over time, and there can be misrepresentations of things that take place at a subconscious level and all those sorts of things. But as a general rule, the operating system of your subconscious mind is storing everything ever. And it's colored with all the emotion that's in there from the experiences themselves. So what this means is that if you've been in an experience with somebody where vulnerability felt really bad, then when you open up and you are vulnerable and you're present in the moment and your neurochemistry, you've got a lot more oxytocin because you're bonding, you're connecting, maybe a little more serotonin and dopamine because it feels good in the moment to connect. And then all of a sudden that neurochemistry fades off and you go home and you think about it and you're like, wow, like what's going on here? And usually if you could watch, there's two things that often take place. Maybe just one for certain dismissive avoidance, but most often two. Number one, you start fearing, like all those stored subconscious association when the neurochemistry calms down. It's like, you can think of the neurochemistry, elevated neurochemistry as like being like, it's like drinking alcohol, right? It's like your inhibitions are lowered for that period of time. Then when that sort of wears off, I couldn't think of the word wears off, fades away. Then you start like feeling all this like, oh my gosh, fear, because those triggered associations start getting louder about what it means to be vulnerable. I'm unsafe. This is bad. This is scary. And all those triggered associations come up for the dismissive avoidant. And then number two, as a secondary layer, what often also takes place, and this is something that I feel sad for in dismissive avoidance, and is so important to work on, is usually the secondary part of this is that you start shaming yourself. And like, we can't feel shame unless we are actively shaming ourselves. So you start going, oh my gosh, I said this, I shouldn't have opened up about that. That was too much. And you start shaming yourself and creating that dynamic. And then what does shame make us want to do? Shame is the emotion that makes us want to hide. And so then you pull back, retract, hide, protect yourself. And then for the person on the other side, it's like confusing because it's like, well, we had such a great time together. And then you pull away like this, like, what's going on? And that's usually the dynamic that's happening underneath the surface. And so you want to work that out in two parts. Like, do your work around your stories around vulnerability and connection. And then do the work to make sure you catch yourself shaming yourself and you choose different ways of thinking and reframing the situation. Like, what was good about opening up? How was that a positive thing? How did the person respond? Like, how is this moving the relationship along? And put an end to that self-shaming, because it's a really, really painful thing to go through. And like, even if somebody is shaming you or saying something shaming towards you, unless you accept that thing as a truth, you can't actually feel the emotion of shame, right? If somebody's shaming you for doing a great job at work, you're going to be like, well, like, I feel good about that, so I don't feel shame. Like, what's going on with you over there? Like, where's this coming from? And so it's going to tell you a lot about what's happening in your internal reality. Like, you have to accept shame or be actively shaming yourself to take part in creating the emotion of shame internally. So I hope that makes sense. Hi, Dawn. Hey, Thais, really loving the webinars and resources in the school. I hope you're keeping well and safe in these times. Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful. I am keeping well and safe. Thank you. Thank you. So the next question I have is Dawn. Wondering if you can talk about the BTEA, beliefs and thoughts behind the emotions, actions FAs take when they feel unloved or unsafe, and the decision to suddenly withdraw hard. This is an awesome deactivating question. Or push their long-term partners away. My wife did a U-turn one day out of the blue. It's unnerving to see the lashing out and sadness. Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. That's not fun. And it's tough too when it's like a long-term partner and stuff, and it's like coming out of like seemingly nowhere. So you want to hear, so this is, I'm going to phrase this so everybody, so it's clear. So you want to hear why the fearful avoidant is deactivating so hard when they have the wounds triggered, the belief and thought patterns triggered that are associated with being unloved or unsafe. And then the decision to suddenly withdraw or push their long-term partners away. So here's what's happening. These are probably like two of the greatest wounds for the fearful avoidant. And remember we said like deactivating occurs around fear, like it's ultimately fear that's taking place. So it's interesting too, because like a lot of fearful avoidants experience wounds differently. You can think of things as being like conscious, subconscious, and then as you get into the depths of the subconscious where things are less easy to retrieve and almost like unretrievable, or harder to retrieve, we get into like layers of the unconscious mind. And when you're in a position as a fearful avoidant, I know it's your wife, but let's say your wife is in this dynamic. A lot of fearful avoidants will say like, I don't really feel unsafe. I feel trapped. But you'll see like the way we can find where wounds are really, really hurtful is when people have like these natural unconscious coping mechanisms. We know that they're still core wounds. So for example, what I've often observed through a lot of fearful avoidance over the years is that they'll say they don't feel unsafe, but they will like hyper respond to feeling attacked. Like if somebody is like attacking or rude, or somebody who's maybe an authority figure could make them feel unsafe, does something that violates a boundary, they tend to like blow up and all these different things. And it's like, well, why are you responding so strongly? It's like a survivalistic response. And then if you trace it way down through the layers, almost to like the parts of the unconscious mind, we see that, wow, I actually feel really unsafe. And I'm in a state of like hyper compensating for that if something takes place. I have an extreme fight reaction. And so there's that. And then unloved or unworthy. And so what fearful avoidants tend to experience, which are sort of like extensions that I think could even lead back to those wounds, are trapped, helpless, powerless, but really underneath that could definitely be unsafe, or unloved and unworthy. They tend to experience like I am bad is a really painful one. So what's taking place is that for them to withdraw, whatever stored associations they have from childhood related to those really painful, almost unconscious core wounds are activated and triggered. And those things are so strong when they come up, and they're so hard to grasp. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm feeling trapped, or I'm feeling, it's like the more woundedness there is, the more the person is investing and buying into that story. So let's say, for example, that you were like, let's move houses, let's do something. And maybe she felt not taken into consideration, or like, hey, you made a unilateral decision about something, or whatever it is. Like, I'm just picking a random example. And let's say in her mind that triggered, well, then I can't trust you because you're making unilateral decisions. And then that triggered like, wow, then I'm unsafe. And let's say those things come up, and then she starts building a story because she starts seeing through that lens, which is what we do when we're deactivating, by the way. All fearful avoidance, dismissive avoidance, when you're deactivating, you keep looking for what the problem is. You're not like, oh, I feel unsafe. You're like, I feel unsafe. And then unless you get out of that deactivating mindset, or it equilibrates itself, or there's a change, or you work things out with a person, you keep seeing through that lens. You keep building this narrative of how you're further unsafe, and how, look, and Don's doing this, and now I'm unsafe here. And that narrative gets so strong. And then a fearful avoidant feels usually too unsafe to communicate, or feels like I don't want to be weak by communicating, or whatever other core wounds are intermingled with that. And then by the time it's like there's an opportunity to communicate or resolve something, it's like they've just pushed away and fled the scene. And this is something fearful avoidants tend to do. And it can be out of the blue externally, but internally, oftentimes they're like building this ongoing narrative in the background for a prolonged period of time. And the challenging part of that is that they often feel like they can't communicate, and they have painful core beliefs around communication, or that they'll be received or heard, or it's sort of like an unconscious block. And then their way of equilibrating becomes, okay, I built the story. Okay, now I need to flee, and that's going to make me feel safe. And so often that's what's happened in the background the whole time. And so what's really required to resolve that is for the person to be able to like put everything out on the table, share why, get transparency around what was going on from your side of the situation, come to an understanding, and then feel like they can start expressing their needs consistently over time. And that needs to be a conversation that's had. And so those are really important components of shifting that dynamic. And I hope that was super clear. Thanks for sharing that, Dawn. Yeah, absolutely. So, hi, Annette. Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Sarah. So Irene says, I spent most of my day trying to manage my emotions by journaling, doing PDS work, or meditating. Afterwards, I felt exhausted. And I tipped over easily, which requires me to roll over again. I feel like I have no resilience at all. So one thing that can happen, right? And like, I want to mention that I've seen you in here, and I've seen you when you started, and the way you were sort of like looking towards other people, like, oh, this is the problem. And now you're like doing the inner work. And I've seen like a huge period of growth in like the short time that you've been here, Irene. And so you're saying I regulated myself and then I got triggered again. And like, I want you guys to look at this experience as, if you can get those tools and if you can be relentless at using those tools. So like, then I get triggered again. Good. I'm going to go back through, taking a moment, questioning my stories, identifying my needs, getting my needs met. You want to think of like this as being no different than a relationship to somebody outside of you. And if we have a loving relationship, a romantic relationship with somebody, and then they leave and then they don't come back for, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, when we start to work things out with them, we're going to be like, like, can I trust you? It's going to take a little bit of time to rebuild that trust, to feel like we can soothe through them. And it's going to take consistency of practice, opening up, getting comfortable over time, doing the work through that person, having those harder conversations until they become normalized. Like, I can remember with myself, like when I was learning more about communication, it takes a little bit to feel like the first few times you communicate needs really vulnerably. It's like really scary, but then, years and years later, it's like the most normal thing ever. And soon after, a few months after doing, I would say like by the 4th, 5th time you start having really vulnerable conversations with people that are close to you, it doesn't feel scary anymore. But I want you to think of like, if that was with somebody else, it's just going to take a little bit to like trust. And the same thing happens with ourselves at a subconscious level. If at some point in time in the relationship to self, we just disconnected, we ignored ourselves, we repressed our needs, we stomped on our boundaries, we let our boundaries be violated, we didn't speak up, we ignored what we were feeling, we tried to disconnect from our emotions, we told painful stories and didn't realize how they were affecting us. As you start, and if that's been like a really intense thing over here, as you start, your mind has to like rebuild a sense of trust with self, with the ability to self-soothe, with doing the work, trusting yourself to show up for yourself. And it's the consistency of doing it and the repetition of doing that wires that programming and framework in to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, I trust myself now. And so the fact that you're doing that is so beautiful. The fact that you're regulating and getting results out of regulating is beautiful. Don't judge yourself as not having resilience for the fact that you were triggered later. Like, that's okay. Then just go back, return to that drawing board. So that's the first part. And as you do that repetitively and really get that in there, it's going to be powerful. But the other thing I would say is, it sounds like you were like regulating through the stories, which is wonderful, and meditating. But I wonder if the second part was touch, the doing the needs work. Because if somebody then triggered you again, I would wonder, am I setting boundaries? Am I communicating my needs? Maybe you did the regulating over here, but the second part of regulating that can still cause pain is, am I showing up to share my needs with others, to communicate, to talk, to do all that work? And if I am, then that's beautiful, but that's a really important thing to take part in. So that's what I would really focus in on in this part of the dynamic. These are great questions, you guys. Hi, Rehane. Hi, Rachel. Taking the FA course, I want to understand what the experience feels like for them. Yes. Okay, good. I hope yeah. It's a story built in the background for so long, Dawn, that then it becomes this like cataclysmic event because it's so painful after things are repressed. Great questions. Hi, Kelly. Can you advise what to do when a DA uses his deactivating strategies? If they ask for space, do you wait for them to return? This is a great question. Or can you reach out after 7 days? Great question. Here's what I would say. If it's in person and the person's like, I need space, I would be like, okay, I hear you. I'm definitely going to respect that. I want to give you as much space as possible. But in order for me to respect that, I know I'm going to feel a lot of uncertainty when this takes place. can you tell me like roughly how long? I may not have an answer, but is this space for like a couple hours, or is this space for a few days? And like, I need some clarity on what this space means and why you need it, so that I can best not get triggered by that experience and then respect your space accordingly. And the more you have that, the more information you're going to have about space. If this person's like, I need space because I'm feeling off and sad, and like, I'll give you a call tomorrow, I just need space for the rest of the day, then it's like much easier to manage than if somebody says, I need space, you walk away, and then you're like, did the relationship end? Is this a breakup? What's happening? And then it becomes like this really painful war, because all those unmet needs for certainty are triggered, right? And then it becomes like a triggering event to go through. And so it's really important to get as much clarity as possible and say, like, link it back to that person's need. I need this so that I can respect this for you here. And that's my intention. And that will be a really important thing to do. It's a great question. Hi, Andrea. Hello, Annette and Tiffany. Awesome. Yes, amazing. Which of the two have a harder time with intimacy and vulnerability, DA or FA? FAs have an easier time with vulnerability for sure, and with intimacy for sure on a regular, like as a pattern. But FAs have more volatility locked into that pattern. So they have more like coming and going, versus dismissive avoidants have like a harder time getting to the intimacy and vulnerability. But when they do get there, they tend to stay there. I would think of like the growth journey for dismissive avoidance. If you imagine like a staircase, the fearful avoidants are going like 5 steps up and then like 4 steps back, and then like 5 steps up and 3 steps back. And they're kind of going like this, right? And it's like they're growing over time, but it's like this volatility of swinging. Dismissive avoidants on their journey are like 1 step, stay there for a while. The next step, stay there for a while too. The next step, maybe stay there for a very long while. And then the next step. And so they don't tend to like go up and down so much, but they just tend to be slower to move up. And it's because they're really trying to gauge, is this safe? Am I vulnerable? Am I okay? And when they get to that step, they kind of have to pause and adjust and look around and get used to it. And then they're like, okay, then I have to gather up my feelings again to then take the next step. And it's sort of like a process like that, specifically as it relates to intimacy and vulnerability. It's a beautiful question. Hi, Melissa and Natalie. Okay, so Sarah says, hi, Sarah. Oops, my cursor just jumped around again. Just a moment. Sorry, sometimes my cursor looks like, I think it stays the size it was when I was at the point that it's at. So then when I scroll down too much, it goes so far down, I think, to equalize a little bit. Okay, so Sarah, there we go. I found it. Okay, so Sarah says, I've had a breakthrough with an old program I do in my relationships with people I'm close to or get closer to. And when codependency kicks in, starting that course next week, I tend to deactivate and unleash my insecurities onto them by painting them as a bad person, especially in conflict. I feel exposed or blame goes on to me. I don't take it well. I discovered this week after my best mate pointed out that I made her look like a best friend. Is that the end of the thing? Okay, cool. So number one, that's a really beautiful realization, quite honestly. It's definitely a breakthrough in terms of recognizing this is what happens. I want you to know that it's because the codependency kicks in, and it's the subconscious associations you have to codependency that you're projecting onto the person that then makes you want to pull away. So for example, like if you can break it down into 2 parts, it's like, let's pretend I'm you. And let's pretend I had a relationship with Bob. Let's say I had 2 parents, okay? And let's say I had codependent relationships with both of them. And let's say at a subconscious level, I was pretty aware that, ouch, codependency hurts and it causes a lot of pain. So then I go and I grow up and I go into my adult romantic relationships or friendships or close relationships with people around me. And maybe it's all good. And then when I start really opening, my subconscious goes, well, I know what love is. It's codependency. This is how love works. And then when I'm in that codependent relationship, I get triggered by the components of codependency that hurt. the engulfment or enmeshment that happens, that enmeshment trauma, that like loss of sense of self, the violation of boundaries as a part of love, like these things about codependency that hurt show up in me. And then I get into like this volatile relationship once I've entered into a lot of closeness with a person because I'm loving through codependency, which hurts. So my subconscious mind is like, well, this person's the source of your pain because without them, you feel fine. And then it works to deactivate and push that person away accordingly. When in fact, and I hope everybody sees that, right? That's really important for all fearful avoidance. When in fact, it's actually the way that you're giving and receiving love that hurts you. It's the codependent actions you're taking that are hurting, not necessarily that person. And so what that means is like breaking that down is such a necessity because it requires speaking up for my boundaries. And it's scary when you're used to loving codependently, speaking up for my boundaries, communicating my needs, saying no to things sometimes, and then not guilting and shaming myself for it. Being careful about what I commit to and say yes or no, like all these different things are so important. And that's part of the dynamic you need to be operating from, to not feel like those triggers come up and then the volatility comes up accordingly. So beautiful, beautiful, share, because it's a profound pattern that you're noticing, which is wonderful. So the next one is, would love a deeper explanation, an example of how to use the emotional mastery course. I mean, examples on how to do the homework for emotional mastery. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, that's beautiful. That will always be one of my favorite courses. So what I'll do is, we didn't record that coursework workbook module yet, but when we launch the needs one and get feedback, it's like up right now. But I'll put a link to it in the Facebook forum and get feedback. Then I'll go through and we'll do like every exercise in the emotional mastery course, and we'll do like different, maybe I'll put in that post too. Tell me the different things that you're working on from the emotional mastery course, because there's such a variety of things that can apply. It can be everything from like my romantic relationship to like loss or grief to like, you name it, whatever painful points that are showing up. And then I'll do different exercises based on what's happening and being upvoted the most. And I'll use those examples as exercises for the workbook as a model to work through. Wow. Great idea, Kelly. I love that so much. Of doing that for the workbook. Sorry, I just want to write this down really quick. I should do that for everything. You guys give me such good ideas. I should say, like, for each of the courses, I wonder if this would be like really messy on the Facebook forum, but maybe I'll do like one every couple weeks. For each of the courses, what are the specific things you guys are working through? And then I'll actually do, when we record the workbook modules for the courses we haven't yet, live examples for those things specifically, so you can see how to work through yours. Anyways, okay, got off track. Amazing. Okay, so an uncomfortable talk with your DA. Hi, Summer. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Magni and Marine and Ruby. Hello. Well, different core wounds trigger different activating and deactivating strategies. Absolutely. And can you elaborate? Yes, 100%. So it will not just trigger different ways of activating and deactivating, but it will trigger like different intensities of activating and deactivating. So let's say, for example, let's look at like activating, because it's a really obvious example. Let's say you're feeling unseen as an anxious, preoccupied. Let's just say fearful avoidant. We'll just say the anxious side of fearful avoidant. Let's say that you're experiencing being unseen. Well, maybe you'll have an activating strategy, and activating and deactivating strategies aren't necessarily the most like productive, effective things that we do. Usually they have a really strong downside, and they're more for like immediate gratification or relief, whether they're activating or deactivating. But let's say that there's the anxious side of the fearful avoidant, and so you feel unseen or unheard, and you're like, oh, I'm going to make my partner jealous, and that's my way of getting their attention and trying to activate, right? Or maybe maybe you feel abandoned, and then you're going to call a lot and try to bring the person back, right? Or maybe you feel uncertain about something, and so you are like, I'm just going to ask this person's friends and family things, and you're violating these boundaries, but it's this form of activation. So different wounds will have different behavioral patterns attached to them, absolutely. And then on the other side, deactivating takes the same form. So, if a fearful avoidant, let's say a dismissive avoidant feels unsafe, they might like retreat altogether and try to get away for very long periods of time, right? If they feel shamed, they might like withdraw because they tend to have that same coping mechanism or behavior. It tends to be like their one size fits all major coping mechanism. But then when they return, they might do things that are like creating passive aggression, right? Or then, that once they've taken a step back, or sometimes they won't take a step back if they're not triggered enough, but sometimes you'll just see the passive aggression manifest, right? Sometimes a dismissal avoidant will be upset about something from 4 days ago with their partner, and then they'll drop a passive aggressive comment way after. And I've had many conversations with dismissal avoidants over the years, like in couples work, and they'll sit down and they'll be like, yeah, I made that rude comment to my husband or to my wife because 3 days ago they criticized me about X, Y, and Z. And the dismissive avoidant like holds it because they're not resolving, right? So often they hold, and then it comes out in a different way. Sometimes they are just masterful at repressing enough that it doesn't come back up in that form right away. But a lot of times they sort of appear in that version. So you see, right? Like passive aggression is a deactivating strategy. It's a way of pushing somebody away or getting space between you and a person by building a wall through criticism, through being a little bit mean or a little bit aggressive or contemptuous towards somebody, right? Stonewalling is a different version of that. And it's still a subconscious strategy to push somebody away, right? And so calling many times when you feel abandoned versus trying to make somebody jealous are different versions on this side. So yes, it's a fantastic question. And so what you want to do when you're looking for yours is like, how do I act when I'm deactivating? Like, what comes up for me specifically? What's my behavior? Because that's my version of deactivating. And then if you catch yourself doing it, like I have somebody who comes to mind who I was working with in the past, and they would say like, my husband and I get in a fight and I'm in the car going for a drive and I'm leaving the scene. And it's like, well, when you see yourself in your car next time you're in a fight and you're getting in, you're like, oh, geez, like this is my way of deactivating. This is my way of retreating and withdrawing from the problem and fleeing the scene. Like, what do I want to do instead? How do I want to show up instead? Maybe I'm going to try to just like not deactivate so much. And maybe I still want to respect my need for space. But maybe I'm going to go back inside because her husband would get really triggered when she would drive away. Maybe I'm going to go back inside and just go upstairs to a room and close the door. And maybe that's just a step towards creating a change. And then I'm going to process, and then I'm going to try to go back and resolve as soon as I can. And then maybe next time, and you can keep incrementally shifting your patterns of behavior the more awareness you have around the dynamic of what's occurring. So great questions. So Andrea says, is it normal for a DA to maintain contact with you or the ex? He seems to withdraw anytime I try to be clear on what I would like, on what he would like to see happen between us. Yeah, so that can be the fear of like, a lot of dismissive avoidants feel like pressured or uncertain, and both of those things trigger a feeling of unsafety. And so it's like, oh, let me be clear. Let's have an honest conversation. And they're like, well, I don't know my answer. Or they have their own competing needs, or they want connection, they want closeness, but that's in competition with fear. And if they feel like I don't know what I want, I don't know where I stand, then they withdraw too. And so usually there's like a lot of that taking place. And what I would say, to be quite honest, is if that's where you're at, I would just set an internal deadline, and I'd be like, how long? Because it can be frustrating, right? For your healing process as an individual to have an ex and you're in this dynamic or situation with your ex and they're reaching out and they're sending mixed messages. And I would sit and I would be like, how long will I put up with this for before I get an actual decision, or until I see the needle move in a way? And if I don't see things happening, then like maybe I should try to move in a different direction or something like that. So I would try to get really clear with like what that deadline is for you, so that you don't have somebody like, pinballing around and making you feel uncomfortable. And is it normal for them to maintain contact with you? Usually it's if there's some degree of interest, they tend to do that. Or if it was a very light relationship and there was a friendship first and they're just trying to maintain a friendship, or if they reach out very periodically, kind of for like a little bit of validation to a certain degree that like there's still connection there. But that's not the thing, right? Like we can't look. I see a lot of people when they see this type of behavior from anybody, from a loved one, like dismissive avoidant, fearful avoidant. Sometimes what I see is it's like this. It's like, well, if I wait around, well, it'll be like this. It'll be like, if the person's interested in me, then I don't want to lose that. But you don't want to be judging like how successful this situation could potentially be based on if somebody's interested in you. Because I'm sure lots of people have been interested in you over the years and like it never led to a relationship. So what you want to be thinking is like, what do I want? What are my needs? And is this person willing to meet me there? The person, he could be the most interested in you forever. He could be 10 out of 10 of interest, but if he's got 9 out of 10 of core wounds that are stopping him from wanting to be vulnerable, open up, move the relationship along, you're only going to get 1 out of 10 of that person. And so you want to be clear about like, what am I going to get out of the relationship dynamic? Will it be fulfilling, rewarding? Will it give us an opportunity for both of us to thrive and grow and communicate and share and connect? And if it's not, then I have to make sure I support that deadline, not based on whether he's interested or not, but based on like what the dynamic of the relationship will look like. And I think that's an important like mindset shift for a lot of different people. So Natalie, hi Natalie. I've been doing PDS courses and work, but I have the feeling that I'm not going deeper. So do you feel like you're blocking yourself? Not doing therapy currently, as I find sometimes I know more things from your courses as they do. Okay, that's good. You feel like you know more than your therapist. Okay, so what I would ask yourself, like, where you're not going deeper. I want to help you with that because it sounds like sometimes what can happen is like the subconscious mind can create a wall and it can be like really indirect, but it's like, oh, I don't want to touch that thing over here. I don't want to X, Y, and Z. So if you feel like you're not getting as much out of therapy as the work, but then you block yourself from doing the work, like sometimes it can be useful to have somebody there to help you sort of break through. So I would do exactly this because this is how you can be this for yourself. I would write a list on one side, like divide your page into 2 columns. And I would write a list on one side of like where I want to go deeper specifically. And then on the other side, I would write a list of like, and so this might be like in my relationships, in my, whatever it is, because there might be things you're not like allowing yourself to see or feel because your subconscious is creating this like way of keeping you safe. And so in the next block or like the next column in your divided piece of paper, I would then write, what stops me? What am I afraid of doing the work around that's stopping me from going deeper in this specific area? And so maybe you're like, I want to go deeper in relationships, but I try to sit down to do the work on relationships. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to do that tomorrow. I'll come back to that later. Or you do a little and it's sort of, you start the work, but then you stop, things like that. So what I would do is I would go, okay, and what am I afraid to feel about relationships? What's come up from me in the past? Has it been about, I don't want to feel how little I trust people. I don't want to feel the experience when I was 5 years old when that thing, whatever it is, fill in the blanks. Do you have some awareness? And then another little tool, if you guys catch yourselves trying to avoid going into some of the work and the workbook exercises, if there's a little bit of avoidance, try to pause and like take yourself walking one by one through the steps and try to feel the emotions that come up with you in your body. Try to really feel into them. Like, okay, where do I feel? I feel resistance right now or distress. Okay, where do I feel that in my body? What is it communicating to me? And try to really like anchor the experience into your body. And that really helps your subconscious mind to open up as well. So great questions. Hi, Adina. Hi, Marta. Welcome. Hello. Welcome to Lika. Nice to see you guys at your first webinar. Hi, Liz. And Dallin, hello. Amazing. Okay, so here's Tulika's question. This is my first webinar. So excited to see you live. Thank you. Thank you for your consistent presence and support and wise words and insights. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, you guys, and for the kind comments. So Dallin says, hey, PDS community, I have been a member in the group, but haven't shared my story. Still very scared to and still learning on my own. I would like to build with others over time. That's beautiful. And there's no pressure. You can share like little pieces of things that feel good and resonate as you go and until you feel like really, really open. So thank you for sharing that. That's a really good start. So Ruby says, I feel like I had narcissistic traits with ex-partner that I picked up from my mother. It is the narcissistic wounds, though my coping mechanisms might have been different. Yeah, sometimes if there's a narcissistic parent or parents, you'll sometimes see like there's certain narcissistic qualities that come up because like one wound can sort of like create another. But often what I find is that it's more like in polarities. So for example, let's say you have two narcissistic parents, or like, let's say in your specific example, you have a narcissistic mother, and let's say she needs like a lot of attention and there's like chaos and things like that. You might have, so let's say just those two factors, a lot of chaos growing up and needing a lot of attention. So you might have a split like this, where you then go, oh, relationships equals chaos, life equals chaos. This becomes a comfort zone. You adopt that. And so you might have that trait or quality. That's not actually part of narcissism, but let's just say like that quality from maybe part of her patterning as a person. And then you also might have, you might pick that one up, but you might go in the exact polar opposite direction because she needs so much attention. You might feel like, oh, I give lots of attention because that's my subconscious comfort zone. I'm always giving attention to mom. And then maybe you feel like, oh, it's bad if I receive attention because I'm taking away attention from her. And that could get me punished or ignored or whatever it might be. So you might see that like you have polarities more than you're actually in that exact space. So it's a good thing to recognize. Thanks for sharing that. So Shahira says, how can I identify that I'm deactivating and not just reacting to a situation? Okay, beautiful question. So here's how to look at if you're deactivating, okay? Here's a set of steps that's going to really help you to recognize, okay? Number one, I want you guys to maybe even like write these things down if you find yourselves deactivating. Number one, I want you to ask yourself, am I feeling this way right now because of a need I haven't communicated or isn't being met? Because a lot of reasons that FAs and DAs deactivate are because they have a need. They've subconsciously, because they've been taught this way or they've been programmed this way, they're not getting, they have this subconscious belief it's I can't communicate a need, doesn't work. And so we then enter into like mind reader space. Like if this person loves me, they would know my need. And then when the need is not met, we then blame and then we deactivate and then we want to push the person away because we're actually hurt that the need is not being met and we feel unseen or unloved or unimportant that the need is not being met. And this happens not just, I know those are a lot of like FA sounding wounds, but the exact same thing happens for DAs too. So that's number one. Am I deactivating based on a need that's not being met? Because if that's the case, you know this is a solvable problem. This is like, hey, let me get clear about the need. Let me go bring that need to the table. Okay. Number two, am I feeling this way because of an old trigger or wound more than something in this moment or equal to? And that's your next step to looking, right? Because let's say Bob was rude. Okay. Maybe Bob was short. And maybe you're like, ouch, like that kind of hurt, but maybe that's like a 3 out of 10. And maybe how that could become a solvable problem and be like, hey, Bob, I don't know if you meant anything by it, but your tone was kind of sharp a second ago and it didn't feel good. Like, is there anything you want to talk about or address? And can you please not talk to me that way? And that became a really solvable problem in all of 10 seconds of your life. That's like out of the way. But if you're like, Bob is rude and I am disrespected, and all of a sudden you're in this headspace where you're like, Bob is so disrespectful. Why am I dating somebody who's disrespectful? This is ridiculous. I will never be with somebody who treats me this way. I'm leaving the relationship. I'm getting in my car. I'm out of here. Then like chances are you went into like some kind of old wound and stored associations of, because what would have been, how much that could have triggered you in the moment is disproportionate to how you're reacting, which is always a symptom of stored subconscious emotional residue that's flooding to the surface. And that's more of what you're reacting to. And so this is the next big way of being like, okay, is this based on deactivating? And you can think of deactivating as usually being about things that are actually solvable problems if we stepped out of the deactivating and then went into the situation. Now, a doubt, okay, instead of, and deactivating is like easy to regulate once you get in the swing of it, right? Once you start becoming aware, I am deactivating, number one. These are my patterns and this is what I tend to deactivate over. Oh, this old wound. Okay, I'm going to question the story and then I'm going to communicate a boundary, or I'm going to express a need instead of pushing the person away. And so once you can tend to like get through those components, deactivating becomes like brought into balance and equilibrated quite quickly. But if you are dating Bob and Bob's rude to you, time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4, you're like, Bob, like I've mentioned this boundary 3-4 times. I notice that the same pattern keeps popping up. Like, what are you going to do to work on this? Otherwise, this is not going to be a healthy dynamic for me, because your tone and the way you're speaking to me, that's a non-negotiable for me in a relationship. And so, like, can we change this? And if you just keep seeing the same pattern of behavior, then that's a doubt. That's a red flag. Like, by the second time Bob's rude after you've communicated once, that's like a big red flag. If Bob continues to be rude or disrespectful, and obviously, it could be that Bob's grumpy and his tone's a little sharp versus Bob saying actually like rude things, and you have to like see, the difference. But if we have something where it's like, I've communicated, I've regulated, I'm in this space and something's happening and it doesn't sit well with me, or it's hitting against a non-negotiable I have for a relationship dynamic, you're in like doubt, not the right relationship territory, not deactivating territory based on fear and old wounds that are coming up that are important for you to regulate or work through. And so those are really important ways of like navigating the situation. So thanks for asking that, because that was part of the content for today. Hi, Tony. Hi, David. So David says, how can my partner and I support each other after an argument when he AA and me DA just seem to trigger each other in turn? Okay, so this is a great question. So here's what often happens between an AA and a DA. A DA needs more time to warm up, right? After an argument. It's just like the nature of how you self-soothe, how you respond to things. And usually the more like running on empty we are with a relationship, like think about this. Let's say a dismissive avoidant, and part of like the nature of dismissive avoidance is you often won't like your needs to be received, or you won't feel like it's appropriate to need anything from others because a long time ago that would have been conditioned out of you. And so you think it's not appropriate to receive needs, and maybe you don't feel like it's appropriate to be very vulnerable to people. Now, I want you to imagine two separate situations. I want you to imagine Mary and Bob, and they've been together for 20 years and they've shared everything and they've been vulnerable and they've been through so many hard times together and lifted each other up and encouraged, and they both positively validate each other all the time. And then Mary says something sharp to Bob one day, when that whole week they've been in a great space and like really looking out for each other and making coffee and breakfast for each other in the mornings and validating each other throughout the day and growing together and working. And then Mary sharp with her tone. Bob's going to be like, hey, Mary, that didn't feel so great, but like, it's going to be a quickly resolved problem. And then I want you to imagine Mary and Bob instead as two strangers. They've never met each other and they're on the street, and Mary comes up to Bob and is sharp with her tone. That's going to like really affect Bob differently in terms of his perception about Mary, right? He's going to be like, geez, that lady, like I talked to her for a second, she was so rude. Versus if they're in a marriage, he's going to be like, oh, Mary's having a tough day. And like, I'm using that analogy to sort of illustrate a little bit, like this is an exaggerated version, of course, to illustrate better, but it's sort of like Mary is and Bob are in that dynamic as the DA, right? Like dismissive avoidance, if you're not receiving a lot of your needs from somebody, if you're not receiving a lot of positive validation from somebody, if you're not opening up emotionally to them and you have them at a distance, obviously when they say something harsh or rude or that's uncalled for, it's going to make you feel like, oh, I need to push that person away more because that person doesn't feel good. Versus if you're in a dynamic where you're giving, receiving, opening, it's great a lot of the time, and you're getting a lot of your needs met. When somebody does something off or that doesn't fit the pattern, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to make you want to like run away and leave the dynamic. And so part of like the dismissive avoidance pervasive deactivation, and I know that's not exactly your question, but I'm going to answer the exact question. Part of the dismissive avoidance, like more pervasive deactivation, also has a correlation with how much they're willing to receive in a relationship. If you're not getting a lot of your needs met from somebody, and if you feel like you're sort of in a one-sided relationship because you get a little bit of connection and things like that, but you're not actively receiving love and actively expressing your needs and actively being vulnerable, then like when something hurts, you're gonna feel it a lot more, right? And that's part of why criticism can be much more painful, because you're running more on empty in that relationship dynamic. And when we are all, as any human beings, running more on empty in life, things that are small have a bigger impact, or things that are big have a way bigger impact, right? And so that's like the analogy I would use. But then when the dismissive, avoidant, and anxious preoccupied are together, what often takes place is you have that space you need that space because the situation's hurt you. You're slower to warm up. And then this person can't understand why because we project from our perception. And usually they warm up quickly and they want to go back to getting their needs met and having harmony. So then usually the anxious after an argument wants to connect faster. And then you feel like, whoa, I need to warm back up again. And that disparity between the two makes the anxious preoccupied feel rejected again. So then they usually criticize again. And then you get caught in this like feedback loop after an argument. So the solution to this is, number one, really proactively start receiving more in the relationship, speaking up, asking for your needs to be met, trying to be more vulnerable, all those different things. Number two, sharing that criticism doesn't feel good or help you. And number three, communicating that part of you deactivating is how you self-soothe, and that you need that time to be respected. And when there is that space that needs to take place for you, to say to your anxious partner, hey, I'm not feeling so good. I'm going to go take some time to myself because I'm in pain, and I need you to respect that time for me, please. Okay. And so that's the dynamic that I would sort of get into. Great questions. Hi, Cecilia and Julia and Adina. Awesome. So Julia says, hi, Thais, had a great day yesterday because I filled my personal need buckets in the day. Thank you. Amazing. That's wonderful. One of the best things you can do as a person, just for everybody's own emotional well-being, is literally to just become really aware of your personality needs, do the personality needs course, fill your buckets on a regular basis and check in with them for 5 minutes daily. And if there's something missing, set an intention to do something to fill that bucket back up. It's just like, it just helps you be so stable in advance, and it brings you into a state of balance. And the more your needs are met, the more quiet the mind becomes too, which is a nice thing. The more peace you tend to have. So Summer says, hi, Summer. Hi, Thais. After having an uncomfortable emotional talk with a DA where he deactivates, is it best to reach out after giving him some space or let him initiate? Great question again. So here's what I would say. In these dynamics, you want to try to be proactive as possible and say, hey, I want to respect your time and space. How much time are you looking at? And do you want me to reach out? And it doesn't leave any margin for error. And dismissive avoidance really want to communicate clearly. They want that kind of dynamic. And they'll probably say, I don't know. I'm not going to know. But yeah, you can reach out in like a little bit of time. I just need some space for now. But at least you're going to get like, it's like the needle moves a little bit. Like at least you're going to get some clarity. And another way of doing it, if the person's always like, I don't know, is you can just say to the dismissive avoidant, hey, I'm going to respect your space for a day or two, but I'm going to reach out in a couple days and see where we're at. And you can let that person know ahead of time. So you've done something conscious and intentional that isn't going to have to feel to them like it's a violation. They're like, oh, okay, she's going to reach out in a couple days. And they might say, no, I'll reach out to you, but they haven't set a boundary and you have. And so it gives you a proactive opportunity to not fall into that pattern. And what I would say is definitely give space first if you're already in the situation. And then if you haven't talked for a full day or 2 days, I mean, it depends how serious the relationship is, but I would say maybe wait for a day, maybe on day 2, or the end of day 1, you can just say something like, hey, still respecting your space. Just wanted you to know I'm thinking about you. I appreciate, like, just something that's kind, and then sort of pull back, and you'll see that person tends to come out of that. So great question, Summer. Okay. So the next question is Liz says, I was married to a narcissist for 29 years, also was sexually abused as a child. Is it really possible to have this much abuse in life and still be able to change behavior patterns, beliefs? Yes, absolutely. So I'm so sorry that there was so much challenge and so many pain points in there. And I'm sure there was a lot that you went through. But the fact that you're right here, right now, and you're like this vulnerable, asking these questions, starting the work, like usually what I find for people who go through a lot of pain is like the mind's an equilibrating machine. That's what it wants to do. So usually once you start feeling like there's momentum, most people I've seen who are doing this type of work, they have all this pain here and then they start to be able to fill it up and transform it. And the mind just like hungers. And so it's like, wow, I just want to keep sort of putting these things back together. And usually what happens is it's sort of like some of the people who I think are like the greatest at this work and who have come the furthest in this work and had the biggest breakthroughs in this work are the people that have had the most pain, because the mind's just hungry to like do it all, learn everything, dive right into it. And so absolutely. And thank you for asking that question. But it does require work, right? It does require, it's not like an easy button or something like that. It would be nice if it was, but it requires work. It requires consistency. But as long as you have those two things and you apply the tools, and you treat yourself like a human, and you're compassionate and kind to yourself throughout your healing process, you're going to be gaining amazing momentum. So thank you for asking. Okay, so the last question I'm going to answer is, I think I just answered Julia's question. Yeah. Yes. Oh, wait, did I answer? I got a text from my DA the other night. No, thanking me for something and wishing me well. I was very vulnerable in a voicemail to him on Friday, asking him what he needs and expressing my needs in a loving way using the scripts from last week. Is it okay to reach out to him with a light message today? Any input? I am FA. I pushed him away several times because of my fear of intimacy, working on healing that, going to the emotional mastery course next. Thanks. Okay, amazing. Thanking me for something and wishing me well. Yeah, I think that's great. I got a voicemail the other night. If it was last night, yeah, I would just send a light message for sure. I think that's beautiful. And it moves the needle a little bit. Just really light, maybe a little short, but definitely. I'm sure he probably was like, wow, really appreciates that voicemail. And then also was like, whoa, like that was so intimate or like so vulnerable. And so he's probably in this like little place. And then you just bring it back to something light. That's perfect. Awesome work. I'm FA. M says, I'm FA who was friends with a DA, was flirting and showing interest as we got very close. This triggered me. I deactivated. I'm FA, friends with the DA. DA was flirting and showing interest as we got very close. This triggered me. I deactivated. He felt rejected. Do DAs ever use jealousy to see if there's interest? Yes. DAs do use jealousy to see if there's interest sometimes. Not always, but they definitely can and will. Or they can use jealousy to try to push you away further, to try to say like, hey, I don't need you kind of thing. And it can be like kind of a way of showing themselves that they are okay. And so sometimes I see either of those dynamics. Either way, it's based on care and feeling hurt. So yeah, it's I don't know if you're just trying to have a friendship or what you're trying to do, but you could always have an honest conversation and say, hey, I get a little afraid sometimes and I'm sorry for pushing you away. Like I do have interest, but I was afraid. And maybe we just need to move in a really slow direction. Like you could say something like that carefully if you feel so. Interesting explanation of anxiety. I broke up with my boyfriend DA because I was afraid of our future together and didn't think he would make a good partner. Why would someone make the changes I asked for and then stop after a time? Or basically, I don't know what he'll do, what he agreed to. I think that's the end of the thing. I'm just going to go through two more quick things, then I really have to run in a second. So I think what you're saying is that why would somebody make the changes and then stop? Sometimes because they forget, sometimes because they think they've done enough. So I think really the measuring stick for like what's going on is going to the person and saying, hey, I noticed you've made these changes. I so appreciate it. You've been doing an awesome job, but then we fell off. And is that like, what's going on? Like, is this something we can keep working on? Did you just forget? Like, I'd like to understand. And if the person's like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to make all these changes, it's too much, then you have an answer. But if somebody forgot, sometimes we have to remember like progress is going to go like this for dismissive avoidance a little bit, right? Like they will forget sometimes and we have to teach somebody what we need regularly and see our needs through. But if you were doing that and then that happened, and then it's problematic and the person's probably not going to be able to meet your needs long term, and then it's good that you left. So you really want to have that like clarity honestly by having the conversation. And it's usually going to be one of those two things. Either the person's like, this is too much work, I'm unwilling, or, oh my gosh, I forgot, I need a reminder until it gets patterned in. And based on which it is, has a vastly different impact in the relationship, right? So Tony says, I'm so FA in my deactivating. And definitely from a dynamic with my depressed mom, I was so enmeshed with her. Yeah, trying to connect, work, pull her out. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm being manipulated And WD, then so angry. Is that infantile rage? I feel like a victim. Why should I have to do all the work to reach out? Yeah. And so what can often take place, right, is if these were these huge pain points, you want to imagine what that felt like as a child. As a child, that would have felt like you being in a situation where you were desperately afraid of what was happening. You were doing work way beyond your capacity at such a young age, so much pressure on you, so much fear, so many things that you shouldn't have experienced at such a young age. And those are going to be stored with so much pain. And so that infantile feeling that you feel, which is a very big signpost of like a time and place that we had a trigger and we didn't get emotional nurturing around, so we didn't evolve through it. That infantile rage you feel is literally the result of unresolved feelings and needs that were unmet at that time in your life. And so what you want to do when you enter into any dynamic is, if somebody's triggering that, you want to be like, what are my boundaries in this dynamic? How can I have a healthy, conscious conversation? And how can I also either meet my own needs or express my own needs? Or maybe if somebody needs something from me now that feels like it's not my responsibility or is too far out of my reach, then I can set a boundary. So you want to go back to the situation with your mom, identify what painful stories came out of it, what unmet needs came from it, and end the re-traumatization cycle by changing those stories now, meeting those needs now, and setting boundaries now that you couldn't have then in a way that's fair for you and has taken yourself into consideration. And that's the process of ending that, so that we're not in a space where we're in automatic coping when that gets triggered. And automatic coping keeps us young in the areas that the wounds occur, because we don't go in and get conscious and grow and evolve. We go into automatic coping and we go into like a freeze state in that aspect of ourselves. So super important to notice. Hi, Chelsea. So good to see you. A lot of my triggers have been hit lately with family members. It's causing me to deactivate and become very despondent with my partner at home. He's feeling frustrated, understandably, and matches my despondency with, you just need to be more happy and optimistic, and cut that out, which feels painful because my emotions aren't being validated. Yeah, so here's what I would do. I would sit down and I would ask for validation. I would sit down and I would go, hey, this is how I'm feeling. Can you see why I would feel this way? I really just need, it's going to help me to heal and move through this if you can just tell me you understand my pain and what I'm experiencing. I don't have to, you don't tell me it's right or perfect. I just need you to tell me you see me, you understand me. And then I would go through that and be like, what do I need from these different people in my family? And what do I need from him? And I would go and communicate those needs as much as possible. If there are people who are unsafe, who you can't communicate that to, then I would instead make sure that I'm working on actively meeting those needs for myself in other areas, right? And then I would also make sure that if people are creating painful dynamics around you, you do absolutely of that in or on, because if somebody's already creating pain, the last thing we want to do is make a story or give it meaning about ourselves and then let that challenging dynamic around us beat us down, right? Or hurt us. And so you owe to yourself, because of those challenges, to be able to set even stronger boundaries and get even clearer about what you're feeling and experiencing. Hi, Ben. Ben is I've seen Ben on here a lot and sharing some really wonderful, even just in small pieces. I know you're doing your work, Ben, and I'm proud of your dismissive avoidance and doing the work and shifting. I can see in the way you talk to people and all these different things. So I'm happy to hear that you're doing great. I know you're chatting with Magni, but I just want to acknowledge you because I've seen you in here so much, putting in the work. Okay, so the last question that I have in here is strong AA here. Just found out my boyfriend is DA. I asked him for us to go to couples therapy. 2 weeks passed, nothing yet. What should I do? I would get clear about what you expect from couples therapy, how long you would like it for, and where to get started, where to end. Bring as much clarity to it as possible. You're probably going to get a lot of pushback originally because it can be something that dismissive ones really don't like or want to do a lot of the time. And if I find dismissal ones too kind of feel safer sometimes in like something they can work on themselves. What's like they don't have to dive right into everything. So I would just say like, hey, even if you're welcome to share your course account with him or something like that. Like just sometimes it'll be more comfortable for them to just do work on themselves or to just have different conversations in the relationship. Like you might say, hey, if you're unwilling, Could we try talking in a different way? Could we try communicating in a different way? Could you try reading this book? Could you try, like, maybe give a suggestion for what you need if that's something that the person feels really resistant to. But before you get to that point, go have a conversation, bring more clarity to it as much as possible. Bring like a time frame, what it's going to look like, what to expect, because the more details he has, the more safe he's probably going to feel in the situation. Hi, Rose and Jesse and Jen. Hello, guys. Okay, so that is all for today. Thank you guys so much for being here, for showing up, for answering for asking such amazing questions. Hi, Anna. And thank you all of you who just, thanks, Sophie. Sophia, yeah, it's a really good idea. That's definitely going to be something we do long-term. Maybe we'll do a webinar on trauma bonding soon. Thank you, Julia. So thank you guys so much just for all of your participation, all of your guys' hard work. I know how, I've done this work myself from the inside out. These exercises come from a lot of spaces where I was learning different things and taking different courses and making my own exercises and doing this work on me first. I know that it is like deep stuff. It's intense. It requires courage and consistency. And I just want to acknowledge everybody in here for showing up and for doing the work and for diving into stuff and for being so supportive of one another, and for being amazing community members, and a big thank you and acknowledgement from me. So I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day. I will see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, and then 3:30 we're doing open Q&A. So I will see you. Oh, I'm happy to hear that, Irene. You are seen, Irene. Okay, have an amazing rest of your day, guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.